And if philanthropy doesn't actively support indigenous led funds to address power structure, it can never support the work of self-determination of indigenous people. So that was very powerful sharing from her. And then we move to a next session on decolonizing philanthropy. I think that has been one of the very important discussions we have been having since last year's retreat. So we, Nitya, our member, IFIP member, she shared that how important it is to understand the complexity and to recognize the diverse political, economic, cultural context of each communities we are working before having any kind of intervention. So with that, we also had another very important session where we discuss about inclusion of intersectionality, like how we can ensure effective and meaningful representation of different intersection groups, including Indigenous women, youth, person with disability, LGBTIQ community members. So we had amazing two speakers, Teresa from FIMI and Dewey from Disability Rights Fund. So I think we all agree, and then in their sharing also that inclusion of intersectionality groups, like in most of the time, they are not recognized, and their representation and participation is very much limited to like tokenism. I think that's how the reality is. And then there is so much need to recognize the diversity and promote leadership. And this intersectional group should be at the center of like decision-making process. So these are very important sharing, like we have had yesterday. We will have a recap session as well. So, but collectively, I think we also agree that we have to go a long way as funders community, as indigenous communities as well. There are like a lot of very good commitments, willingness, and good intentions, but it has to be yet to be translated into actions. So I think that's what we are going to discuss today in today's session, both in track A and track B. That's why it's very important for us to like dive deep into the discussion, like how we as philanthropy community are going towards, and then how can we get there? And we are expecting some like building like collective commitments as a community, philanthropy community. But that will be more realistic, and then which can be translated into realities, into action. So we I think hope as IFIP hope to have that kind of conversation today. So we also had like those who have attended, I think most of you have been attending both the days, day one and day two. So we had created this interactive like space for all of us where we could reflect, question, like comment on like on the priorities for day two specifically. We were focused our interactive space for like sharing our like where are we, and then what kind of priorities we should collectively be made. So I'll just share my screen and then just take you around like what we have discussed and shared together. So just a second. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, here you go. Can you see the screen? Yeah, we have some, I mean, like we have few minutes to share on this. So I'm not going in detail. This will be open for everyone to view. So some of the key priorities that we have identified collectively that I'm going to share here. So specifically coming from our members, friends from Australia, that we need to, there is a suggestion or like to create regional space, more regional space, creating and strengthening that kind of space at regional level and building the collaboration specifically coming from Australia. And this also includes supporting and strengthening the community outreach because most of us collectively agree that there is need to have more community-led solutions, and then community-led decisions to be, like built on by the funders community as well. So that I think we have agreed upon. There are also some suggestions related, like building this relationship with the community that we are working together. Another one is like, it's like we have clustered it together. So I'm just sharing briefly that we need to extend the collaboration and partnership with the communities. That can be done by creating more thematic working groups. That can one way of doing, and more support should be extended to the indigenous philanthropies. I think that's I think in most of the discussions also it's coming very clearly, and then we all agree on that. And increase partnership with the grassroots community based organizations. So that's about the partnership, building collaboration, and also like focused more on the regional level. I think like the community agreement that we all have been like following is like the reciprocity. That's I think has been highlighted here, that there should be reciprocal relationship with the community. So that will, I think, continue to like be a priority for every one of us. I think in terms of co-funding, if I remember correctly, then it was also very clearly discussed and agreed in the last year's retreat that there should be, IFIP should be taking an initiative for like co-funding. Space can be created. So that will be like more, that kind of support is like, one is as a community, like via IFIP that can be created, but the support can be more reaching out to the intersectional groups, and also creating like more of the support to those organizations at the grassroots levels, at the community levels, who are beyond reach. Because we discussed a lot yesterday that there are so many restrictions and then rigidity that we have created that has excluded our indigenous communities to be a part of the discussion, or to be a part of the decision making, to have access to resources. So I think that is how this kind of creating this kind of space, funding can also help to build the outreach at larger level. So I think
Chanda,
there are some more suggestions.
Chanda, yes, sorry to interrupt, but your mic, I think you might be covering your mic. So just be careful with that. We can't hear you so well.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry for that. So I think lastly, I think there are also some, I think everyone we are feeling is we need to have more space for sharing, learning, and exchanging the space at the regional and global level. Many of you have also, some of you have also suggested for having in-person gathering. Definitely, I think IFIP would have done in-person gathering, but like COVID really restricted. Hopefully next year's gathering will be in person for sure. And some of these, yeah, I think the learning space, I think more trainings, that it's more about exchange, like space for exchanging our knowledge, experiences. So yeah, I think those kind of things are, I think most of you have also suggested how we can do it together. There are more like creating leaders from the team at the institutional level and at the community level. And then most of this should be led by the needs, like the priorities, and then the needs and priorities of the communities should be at the center of all our discussions. So I don't think that I covered everything, but this is all open for us to look at the mural here, and then we can have further more discussion of like adding up on your comments as well on day 3 as well, where we will be more focusing on the commitments part. I'll just stop here. Okay. So this was what we shared yesterday collectively, and open for all of us to like look at it and then add more. I'll just go to the next one before we start our today's dialogue and some very important sharings that IFIP has planned for. I think let's watch the recap from track B yesterday. There was very it was an amazing discussions we had. So we have 3 members from the group, sorry, 2 members. Yeah, we could not have 1 session. So yeah, 2 members sharing the brief outcome of the discussions in the group. So yes, may I request Winnie to play the video? Thank you. Okay.
Sure. With the other group, Chanda's group, how are you feeling? Are you feeling prepared?
Yeah, Rachel and Dewey you both are ready, right? Thank you so much for volunteering too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
Rachel, you want to start?
yeah, I'm going to take the first question, and Dewey's going to take the second and third. So the first question we addressed were, what are the gaps and the areas of improvements to enhance the representation and participation of intersectional groups? And some of the comments we discussed and heard were, you know, this usual suspects, these recognized leaders, the loudest voices in the community always are the first to represent the communities, but are not always representative of everyone in the community. And it's a challenge accessing intersectional groups. And there's a deep need to be intentional and purposeful when seeking out the voices and representations of those within groups that don't typically get their voices heard. We talked about recognizing that there are identities within identities, and that these typically create greater vulnerability. The lack of understanding of how intersectionality can exacerbate difficulties in participation, and specifically for Australia, there was a discussion about transport disadvantage and also digital literacy, but then there was a discussion around general accessibility and the need for better accessibility to intersectional groups. Enabling environments across all groups, and typically what happens is that lack of trust that in these groups and their ability to carry out activities. Example, youth and women's group and women's groups. I'll read one more here. And within these groups, it's important to understand a community's own cultural traditions, and don't assume that existing structures are appropriate for these groups that sort of are living on the margins. Dewey?
Thank you, Rachel. Now I will present the second question and third question. It was a rich discussion. I'm not sure I can able to summarize in 3 minutes, but I will try. So the second question is, how can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional effort? How to organize and take concrete steps, bring more intersectional group into the space? In the discussion, we discussed that it will be important to effectively seek out people who represent diversity within community. Consider funding people time to come together and learn from each other. Consider the power dynamic within community and society to address them. Understand the preferred medium and common tools for intersectional group and learn to use them well. Must make sure that funding process criteria are appropriate and accessible to the group it's trying to reach out, particularly when we're talking about intersectionality, that most of the group may be really emergence groups that they might be not yet have like legal standard or register, but we as funders take also the risk to give the opportunity to apply for our fundings, but also ensuring the enabling informants in the process, in the application process, for example, ensuring that we respect also their own language, so they can submit their applicant in their own language, understanding stigma and how to support communities to address it. And we should also remind that the community in themselves is the one that understand the context and have the expertise to really analyze the situation, the context where they are, and develop their works from that. So we need to also recognize that expertise that they have, value the leadership of the community, have a lens in process to check reference for intersectionality, ensure it's part of what we are funding. And the third question is, what role should funder play in decolonizing philanthropy? Apologize for noisy backgrounds. There's a construction near my house. Consider what genuine representative within the institution, not just related to grant process, but throughout the whole organizations. Give autonomy with funding, recognize again expertise in the community, and value the culture. This is should seen as an asset and value that, and not see as a risk. Process and practice make their platform available to give community a voice about what works well and how funder and communities can work together to address the barriers, the challenges they have. And funding indigenous people, not a risk, but it's a smart investment. We should consider that, and rhetoric, but not acting a funder with the right rhetoric, just changes as one who does nothing. Community partner holding funder accountability. I think it's very important to also see how the community also see how accountabilities we ask. And it comes
Maybe just one more point, do we?
Okay.
One more point.
Okay. Sorry. Deconstructing institutionalization and discriminations, giving funding to, when donor funding of philanthropy, giving funding to women, why not also funding indigenous women with disability or indigenous women? So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. I know that that group had a lot to discuss. Sorry for cutting you off, but thank you for taking those diligent notes so we can also see all of the rich conversation that you all had. And now I want to turn it over to the other group. Niall, are you ready to present?
Thank you. Sorry about that. I came in a little late and I wanted to do the rich discussion that I missed just. So the first question was, what does solidarity look like? And looking through the notes, you know, breaking it down to understanding and assumptions. So solidarity is taking the time to understand what really is happening as a result of colonization, and the acknowledgement that it's not just something that has happened in the far past, but is something that has happened in the near past and has continued to happen now, and those impacts are deeply felt on an ongoing basis as well. And that's not only just looking from a non-Western to an Indigenous space, but within the impact of within Indigenous communities as well, and how Indigenous peoples impact on ways of relating to one another is the way that it's been written here as well. I think the other one is the philanthropy playing its role in understanding that it can be as an opportunity to create space for philanthropy to listen as well, and to be challenged, and that's okay, and that's a growth and a way forward as well. So solidarity is creating those spaces and finding the ways to give up power and suspend kind of preconceived notions or thinking, and just sitting in space and listening, deeply listening, not just hearing, but like deeply understanding as well. So the second one is, how can we support each other in navigating these oppressions? And there's this concept that, it's moving from, I guess, summarizing, moving from the performative to the substantive in some way, shape or form. So that is, sometimes not focusing on the big romantic, grand gestures, but actually focusing on the practical and impactful decisions and things that can be done. And that moves from, kind of making sure that Indigenous peoples are well and have the opportunity to heal and support one another. So if that's supporting basic needs around medical education, social services and wellness, then that's a role that philanthropy can play in supporting First Nations people, Indigenous peoples. It also talking about, that again, the decolonizing thinking is that interrogation of whiteness and Western frameworks as well, and the impact that those frameworks have, and that it's not just enough to promote, but it also there's a risk that by just creating spaces within a Western or colonial framework, that those same type of mistakes are going to be perpetuated when you create spaces. So just being really aware of interrogating what those colonial systems are, what their deep impact is on an ongoing basis as well. And the final one was and I was involved in this one, as a robust conversation in particular, which was around what role do we want funders to play in fighting and decolonizing philanthropy. And there was a really rich conversation around, Indigenous-led funds, whether that's a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but what does that look like? Is that, again, perpetuating within structures, colonial structures, but, as a way of shifting thinking and funds into First Nations communities, is really practical and logical as a first and next step as well. And I think, again, Tanya mentioning this idea of foundations getting out of their own head a little bit as well, and out of their own foundations, and that inward focus as well, and starting to look at that external focus as well, and looking at shifting sector-wide practices and mindsets and frameworks as well. So kind of not only interrogating your own behaviours, and that's wonderful, but doing the more substantive work of doing the work to shift and change the sector as well. So, and then there was just, the recognition as well between the link between race, capitalism and colonialism. And, it could probably be a conference in itself as well, but those systems that have enabled, I guess, such wealth in a private philanthropic perspective to be generated, that has given the rise to private philanthropy, and fundamentally how that's not necessarily in a good system in itself. So, by almost what philanthropy's role is, potentially kind of breaking philanthropy so it's not needed in its form, because in its current form, this is what happens as well. So I apologize to the group if I missed anything that was really important, because it sounded like such a richer conversation earlier as well.
All right, thank you. I think it is now on cue. Just to double check with the team. Welcome again, everyone. So good to see you. I'm so glad that you're here with us for the third day of the Funders Retreat. We're going to move quickly through the agenda so that we can hear from our speakers. But before we do that, I'm going to invite to the floor my colleague, Winnie Cody, who is going to be sharing with you some of the things that we are up to. And that includes something that I'm sure you're all going to be interested in, because we have been curious about this particular work that we are now embarking on, doing a membership analysis. So if I can have Winnie join, so I'll invite you to take the floor, Winnie. And we're doing this membership analysis as the next phase of where we're heading at IFIP, and you'll hear more on that from me at the close of the program.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. Good morning. It's evening for me. So Sorry if I seem to just start a bit on the greeting, but good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well, and welcome back after 2 days, and welcome to the 3rd day. I'm going to ask Kwalnaska to please share a presentation with us. But just as she prepares to share the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about a membership analysis that we've embarked on as IFIP, and maybe just go up to the first slide. Yeah. So every year when you're renewing your membership forms, or when we have a new member joining, there's always a renewal form or a membership form that we send out to our members. And many times, on this form, there are several questions that we ask. So what are your total assets? What are your annual grant budgets? You know, the geographic regions that you fund, the themes that you fund, you know, what themes that you fund for Indigenous peoples and so forth. And so what we did is we took all these forms and we started to analyze them to see, you know, to just look at what the answers to some of these questions that we've been asking on the membership forms. And why we do this is so that we can be able to understand our membership and how better to engage with you, and to also understand the funding trends of our membership. Now, why we feel that these questions are important for us to address is because we want to be more intentional at IFIP. We want to be more intentional with our data, and so that we can see how we can take this data, analyze it, and feed it back, or feed back the information to our membership, so that this information can be beneficial to our membership, to see what the funding trends are within our membership, and to see how this information can also influence philanthropy, and then have this information help the IFIP membership learn more about the IFIP community that we have and that we are building, so that we can also be able to connect our members with aligned priorities, who have similar interests, and also be able to offer opportunities of collaboration between our membership, and not just between our members, but also members and other Indigenous partners based on similar interests. And then through this analysis, we can also be able to see what gaps there are in the field. So for instance, if through the analysis, we see that there is a theme that is important for Indigenous peoples and is not being given a lot of attention with our membership, then that's something that we can elevate and say, well, this looks like there's a gap. Who could be interested to be working in this gap that we have found through our membership analysis. So what we did in this past few months is that we looked at our membership forms, and we have, you can move to the next slide, Naska. And we had 49, we have 49 members for this year's analysis. We had 49 members, and from this 49, we only had 28 forms that were filled to provide the responses to the questions that I have just referred to a few minutes ago. So this means that we had the 28 forms filled and 21 that were incomplete. So what this means is that we were not able to get all the information from our entire membership. So the data that I'm going to present now is not inclusive of all the membership, but only inclusive of those members who were able to provide complete data for us to be able to analyze. Now, this is just a beginning. We're going to do a more extensive analysis and be able to present to you the findings that we get. With your help, of course, with your help when you complete completely complete the forms when we send them to you again for your renewal. So just keep that in mind as I continue to tell you what we found. So what we did is from the funding trends. Konaski can move to the next slide. Yeah. So as you can see, that's the annual budgets, the annual grant budgets from the 28 members that completely filled the forms, and also now, and then the amount there just under that is the amount that was allocated to Indigenous peoples. So you will notice that in the form we have a section where we ask what your annual grant budgets are, and then we also asked you to let us know what percentage of that budget is allocated specifically for Indigenous peoples. So that is what we found. And then 17 organizations gave between 80% and 100% of their budgets to Indigenous peoples, and the other 11 gave between 3% and 60% of their budgets to Indigenous peoples. And most of the organizations that give, or all the organizations that give 100% of their budgets to Indigenous peoples were Indigenous organizations or Indigenous-led funds. And then next, what we looked at was the themes that our membership funded. Now, when we came to the themes, we looked at the entire membership because this was information that was available. And what we found, well, those all the things that you can see in the circle are the different themes that are funded by our membership. But we just because of interest of time, I'm only going to mention the top things that the top funded themes, and this was rights. So if it's Indigenous people's rights, disability rights, human rights, racial or gender equality, gender justice, or racial equality. And then another big theme was environment, so environmental justice, education and environment, and conservation, and then climate change. And then just to note that 15% of the organizations explicitly said that they support Indigenous, not Indigenous, but women initiatives. And another 11%, which is about 5 of them, support land and territories. Now, the percentages I've just said are those that explicitly said that they fund either women, land and territories. But this is not an indication that they don't, that the other organizations don't fund women or land or territories, because we're aware that there's intersectionalities, and women and land and territories can always come into the other things that are funded by the other organizations. So when we come to geography, and this is the next one. When we come to geography and geographic representation on where our membership funds, a large number, so 16 members, that's 35% of the membership, give grants to the USA and Canada, while others fund specific geographic areas. So for instance, you'll find someone will say they fund certain states in the US or certain areas in Canada, or they'll say specific countries in different countries globally, but are very specific to their geographic areas. And then we have 11%, 5 of our members who fund exclusively in Australia and New Zealand. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you just a representation of our constellation map that we've drawn from Foundation's maps by Candid. And this is just a snapshot representation of our members, both private and public foundations and Indigenous-led funds who report to the Foundation's map. Some of our members are not available on this database because they possibly do not report. And so I'd like to encourage you to consider reporting so that we can be able to have this information available to us, so that we're able, so that this information can also be available to us. So if you're interested, you could, and if you're signed up to the foundation's map, you could always go and look at what the funding trends are and the information that's available there on the foundation's map. So what's next for us? As we mentioned earlier, this information that you provide us through the renewal forms is important because it helps us learn more about you, learn more about our community, helps us connect, offers collaboration opportunities and all this. And what we would like to say, what we're saying is that what we want to do next with IFIP is actually do a global funding landscape analysis, a more extensive one, but we can't do this without your assistance and without your help and without information from you. And we also want to gather data focusing on Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous peoples and stroke women's organizations. So what we're requesting for you to do is the next time you're renewing your membership, or if I know some of us here are members in waiting, we hope that when we send you the application forms, or when we send you the renewal forms, that you complete the forms and give us the information that we need there, and also ask us questions. If there's anything that is unclear on the form, please ask us questions so that we're able to help us with the information, and we can use the information that you give us to complete the funding landscape analysis that we hope to do in the next year. Next, so finally, just related to building our community and helping us connect with new members and helping us provide information for our membership and build connections between members and between our community members. We at IFIP have in our strategic framework, communications has been highlighted as one of the items that we needed to enhance, and so that we can continue to provide this platform that we already have that enables the self-determined development for Indigenous peoples. And so how then can we do this? How can we do this with your help again? Is that we have found that we need to have a better use for our website and other communication channels, which include now the social media platforms and our communications between us and our membership, so that we can better meet the needs of our membership and the community that we serve. And just listening to what you've been saying in the past 2 days, in your responses as to how you want to see the IFIP community bloom, and how the IFIP community or IFIP itself can support you in doing your work. Some of you have said, you want the regionalized network. This is something Chanda mentioned earlier, having a global resource for Indigenous philanthropies and other interested stakeholders, having Indigenous news and information provided, a space to amplify good practices between members and the IFIP community. And so as we draw from these discussions that we've had in the past 2 days and previous discussions that we've had within IFIP, I want to invite you again to be part of IFIP's website update and rebrand. This is something that we plan to do. And we're going to be asking and we're going to be seeking for your input on how we can design this space to better meet your needs, to better meet your needs, so that you let us know how do you want it to look like, what is the kind of information you want to see provided there. And over the next few weeks, we will be sharing with you a survey that will, and the information that you provide there will feed into our update and rebrand process that we have already started. And we hope that we'll be able to create a space, a learning space, a community space, a space of sharing, a space of collaboration together that will help us to not just to support and also uplift your work, to uplift the voices of Indigenous people, and just generally uplift the work that we're all doing together. Yes, and so I hope that when my emails come calling, that I will find positive responses from all of you, and I look forward to collaborating with you, and especially getting your feedback and getting your insight and information, so that we can be able to not only get information for our analysis, our funding analysis, but also for our communication, our website rebrand and update. So thank you very much for your time. And I think in the next session, we're going to be able to take 1 or 2 questions, and Ponaska will be not just questions, but also comments from you, maybe 1 or 2, because I think that's about the time we have. And then, but we can also continue this conversation offline or after the retreat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winnie. Hello, everybody. What a great presentation. Do we have anybody that has any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself.
Thank you. And we've seen the thumbs up, so we're going to be following the thumbs up and the smiles after the retreat. So thank you so much again. And I look forward to our collaboration after this. So Lotus, back to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Winnie and Ponaska, for working on this. As you can see, this is the start of what having a team looks like. We have been operating for so long with a slim staff, but doing a lot of great work over the years. And now we are heading into a new phase of IFIP that includes more of this work, more of the analysis, more of the putting out resources to all of you. And as Shanda was showing us earlier, from the mural, from all those stickies and all those ideas and those suggestions, there's a lot of appetite from all of you to see IFIP bloom and the IFIP community bloom and something more. And so with that, I'm gonna actually at the end, when I'm closing, I'm gonna share a little bit more of where we're heading. But now I'd like to now turn it over to the next part of our agenda and invite our speakers to lead us through these conversations. And if I can have Susan Balbas join me on the spotlight, because I'm gonna introduce her. Susan is gonna be leading us through the Indigenous-led funds, roles and lessons of philanthropy and their communities conversation. A little bit about Susan. She's a longtime IFIP member, but she is most importantly, as Susan is the executive director of the Na Ilahi Fund. She's not only executive director, but she's co-founder of the fund. She's a community organizer. She carries valuable expertise in all nonprofit operations and management. And she has had held several leadership positions that include heading the National Training and Technical Assistance Specialist for multiple tribal youth programs for the U.S. Department of Justice Tribal Youth Programs through Education Development Center. Susan has been an independent consultant working with tribes, artists, and nonprofit organizations, and as I mentioned, held several leadership roles. She currently serves on the boards of Front and Center, Washington Progress Alliance, and the Potlatch Fund in Seattle. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to take the floor, Susan. And you have about nine minutes or so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction, Lourdes. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me. I am Susan Balbas, as she said. I am a Cherokee descendant on my mother's side and Yaqui and Spanish on my father's side. And I've lived in the Pacific Northwest region almost all of my life, from the time I was a young girl moving up here from the Central Valley of California. And so I'm calling in today from the lands of the Coast Salish people in the Whidbey Island, close in the Salish Sea, close to Seattle. And that is where our office is at Na'ilahi Fund. Na'ilahi Fund means Mother Earth in the Chinook Wawa language. It's a trade language of the Pacific Northwest, which brings together a lot of tribal languages and a little bit of European words here and there. And we use it a lot because it seems to be very inclusive and representative of a lot of the native nations in this area. And yes, I have been involved with IFIP from before the beginning. We kind of brainstormed it at a gathering at the Semiahmoo Resort on Lummi Lands. I don't even remember what year it was, 90 something. Anyway, so it's really a pleasure to be here. And I have really loved being a part of IFIP. It's a place where we feel that we belong, we are understood, and we just love being a part of IFIP. It is very, very important to us to have that support and that camaraderie amongst our Indigenous funds. So what I'm going to do in this brief time is I'm going to talk a little bit about Na'ilahi Fund because I feel that we are such a good model of what an Indigenous fund really does, right? We hear a lot of words about it, but I want to give you some examples about what we do so you can get a flavor of how Indigenous-led funds operate. And then hopefully we have time for some discussion around how we can support each other and really grow this network. So yeah, the Indigenous funds are very diverse, but we all operate on some very common ground, as the excellent report by IFIP published last year really demonstrates, and I hope that you all have gotten a chance to read that beautiful report. So Indigenous-led funds are led by Indigenous people with lived experience. So we are both guided by community, and we are in fact the community. So we're guided by the diversity of our experience, grounded in Indigenous values of sharing and giving, and how we do that in our community and how we've always taken care of each other. So we're located in the Pacific Northwest region. We fund in Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Montana. So within this region, we have what's very common in some other areas where there's a lot of wealth and more progressive and liberal ideals along the coast, a lot of financial resources and fewer in the inland areas. And so a lot of our focus is to bring those resources out to the more isolated Indigenous communities across our region. So we'd like to practice what we call, we're an Indigenous women-led, sorry, that's my dog, she'll just pipe up whenever she feels like it, usually when a truck's coming by. So we're an Indigenous-led organization. We practice trust-based decolonized philanthropy. But what does that mean, right? What does that translate into operationally? Number one, we're informed by community input. So we take long-term approaches. We focus on realities on the ground and not reports that we've read from academics or anything, right? We listen to community. We're responsive to our dynamic community climates and priorities. Our grant-making process are extremely streamlined. We use the submittable portal, which is very, very user-friendly. We also have options to apply by phone or to mail in applications. Our applications have 5 questions. Our final reports are stories. And the stories we ask that people can demonstrate their impact. And then also we want to know how we did in our process. We are intersectional. Our staff are capacity builders, facilitators, connectors, community organizers, and movement builders. Our granting funds, 2020 was all about COVID, as I'm sure most people were. It was, we did lots and lots. We just really busted our butts doing COVID response. And then in 2021, our grant making pools are $1.2 million. We grant in food sovereignty, green infrastructure, still COVID crisis response, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. And we launched a fund to support the families of the missing and the murdered. And that's been a really transformational fund that we launched this year. So the intersectional, we also do cohorts to build and promote leadership. We have a cohort about explaining and engaging with local government. We have a City of Seattle Indigenous Council for the Parks and Recreation, which helps Indigenous people access plants and medicines in the city parks. We have our Sovereign Futures cohort, which is food sovereignty, green infrastructure. We bring together Indigenous thought leaders to share and share their knowledge. We've developed an Indigenous food network. We do land back work and cohorts. Our other cohorts are artists and culture keepers. And we have a new one, which is youth leadership and teaching them grant making to really build that abundance mentality and to really help youth define where they want their youth programming to be focused. We do a lot of fiscal sponsorship. We do land-based work, and we fund a lot of that land-based work through project-specific grant funding. We, over the years, have developed our WISE Action program, which is building leadership around civic engagement, policy, environmental policy. And we also do our Mamuk Sikhs allyship training to work with non-native communities to increase their understanding around not just the historical context, but where we are today and how that history has informed where we are today and what people can do in their lives to step up and support Indigenous people. We are intertribal, inclusive of reservation, urban, and other rural Indigenous populations from the Americas with diverse gender identities, orientations, and we are intergenerational. We bring together families, youth, elders, adults, young people. We're collaborative. We work with philanthropic networks and with non-native partners who share our values and commit to supporting our self-determination and that in our communities. We look for funding partners that can both support us, not IFIP, but who also want to step up and support our grantee partners and their communities as we develop, help them develop their visions and their projects. We often serve as a buffer between Indigenous peoples and communities and sometimes intrusive and racist systems. For instance, in the last few years, we got some government grants from King County here in Washington State to support youth work. And we also facilitated census outreach for the state of Washington with the tribes and urban communities. And I want to say that we were very effective. We were able to raise census response by 15% by the tribes, which is substantial. Once again, fiscal sponsorships. We hold a lot of very long-term funder relationships and major donor relationships. And we're boldly committed to finding the right way within that nonprofit industrial complex to really fund what we need to fund for our communities and not what government or some funders think that we need. So some of our challenges, We continue to experience a lack of understanding of the realities of Indigenous communities and sometimes an unwillingness to learn. Our bold political stances sometimes get us in trouble, sometimes with our supporters. We have learned that it is most advantageous to accept only funding that allows us to be self-determined and support the visions of our communities in ways that are culturally honoring and respectful. And we're a very busy and yet, as you can imagine, and yet a very strategic group. We have very high communication. We experience a constant tension, and I know a lot of these points have been discussed in the last couple of days. But we experience that constant tension around using our resources very wisely. And this can lead to overcommitment and burnout of our staff. So we have to really take a lot of care with our staff. They often wear many hats, and it seems that there's never enough administrative capacity, right, to support our work adequately and our staff. But our positive impacts, we engage the true community change makers, the culture bearers, the innovators, the fantastic grassroots leaders that mainstream philanthropy will probably never meet. We have real and lasting impact in building a movement for land back and economic, environmental, and in climate justice. So as we regain our health, our strength, our voice, and our power, we work to bring us back to thriving communities and regenerative economies. So what are the roles that mainstream philanthropy can play? Be trusting partners in our work. Stay involved with IFIP. IFIP's learning community that stands in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, and ask others to join IFIP. So with that, I'm going to turn it back, and I hope we have some time for questions. Yeah. Thank you all.
Yeah, Suzanne, I hope you can join us on the breakout, because we're gonna
Yes.
we're gonna be diving a little bit deeper on the breakout.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the things that I wanted to mention before I invite Monica, who's going to speak next, is that in fact these breakouts are being designed with a Minka style way of community work, meaning that it's not just dialogues. As you all enter, as you all think about entering the breakouts, you're actually going to be entering into a community work mode. How do we do this together? And what are some of the commitments that each of us can make? No commitment is too small. All actions have impact. And so I invite you to think about this and imagine that you're in the field and you're bringing something to the field and contributing to creating something. In the Andean community and where I'm from in Peru, there's a very known community for continuing the work of building a bridge in the way that it was built for millennia. So, and every community member contributes. It doesn't matter how big, how small. So that's the intention of how we're going to be thinking about going into the breakouts after the break. But let me invite now Monica to come to the spotlight, and she will be sharing on collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. Monica Aleman is a senior program officer of the Ford Foundation, particularly on the Build team, where she works to advance the foundation's efforts to support and develop a stronger, sustainable, and more effective social justice organizations and networks across the globe. Prior to being on the Build program, she was based on the foundation's East Africa office, where her grant-making focused on increasing the capacity of national, regional, and global groups, and supporting national and regional networks to advance a constitutional framework that protects the rights of women and other minorities. Before joining Ford, Monica was the executive director of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, known as FIMI. Her experience includes community organizing and social movement, and we also welcome her as IFIP board chair. Monica, you are welcome to take the floor.
you, Lourdes, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here and to learn from this conversation. I will be speaking from the vantage point of working at the Ford Foundation. So a very distinct experience, I will say, than the one Susan just described. You know, Ford is one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world. It is considered a traditional legacy institution. And with that comes a lot of advantages and disadvantages when it comes to understanding and working with indigenous peoples, I will say. Over the last 80 years that Ford has been in existence, I will say that the progress has been incremental in terms of growing that understanding. And sometimes you feel that you have made more progress perhaps than you have made. So it's a constant learning process. We work, I don't even know how to say it. We work with indigenous peoples. We support indigenous people. We support indigenous people in two different ways: by providing direct support to indigenous organizations and networks, but also by supporting organizations that work with indigenous people or in indigenous territories. I will say that we have a deep understanding that that communities are very diverse and therefore the needs are very diverse. We make use of our grant making types to support these different types of organizations. So we provide institutional strengthening grants. What that looks like is us supporting, for example, ONIC, the National Indigenous Peoples Organization of Colombia, so that they can set up their financial and the financial system so that they can then have access to other form of resources. We also provide core support to indigenous organizations, and we provide general and project support. As I was saying earlier, the level of comfort in providing general support, I will say, has grown over the years. We are not perhaps where we need to be or where we would like an institution like Ford to be, but we have seen tremendous progress in terms of increasing the level of comfort by program officers and the level of trust that they have. But I will say that in general, that is an area that is a work in progress for an institution like Ford. We are, as you know, publicly very committed to advancing the rights of indigenous people, but to a great extent, our systems and our due diligence process keeps getting in the way of providing support. We are, I will say, experimenting with expanding some of our notions and understanding about what does institutional strengthening or what does a strong or resilient organization means, but we are at an early stage of that understanding. The great advantage is that in general, I will say it has been an environment that has been difficult, but also where we have had support from the leadership of the foundation. So it's a combination of, yes, still working in a difficult environment if you're trying to just support indigenous organization, but on the other hand, you do have a high level of political backing and support to try to find a way to support organizations. And as I said earlier, we also work within organizations that work with indigenous people and in indigenous territories. I will say also that for the purposes of transparency, these represent the bulk of the funding that we provide. So if you compare the amount of resources that is going to indigenous organizations versus the amount of directly to indigenous organization, or the organization or the amount of resources that are going to intermediaries or organizations that work with indigenous people, I will say that about 60 to 70% of our resources is still going through intermediaries or organizations that work with indigenous people. That is a data that we are tracking, and that is an important step because I don't think that we ever paid attention to that until indigenous organizations have begun to put a lot of pressure for us to pay attention to that. I have to confess to you that the first time that we ran the numbers, we were surprised ourselves. You know, we had this notion and this idea that we were supporting in a direct manner much more than we thought we were. But then when we saw the number of grants and the actual amount of US dollars that were being given, it took us a little bit of time to reflect and to sit back and to understand that that this was not consistent with what we were saying out there, you know. So I would say we have gone since then, and that happened about 3 years ago when we ran the numbers for the first time. We have begun the process of trying to consistently map and integrate in a slow manner still more and better funding for indigenous organizations, either through our work in the regional office or through our work at the global level. In that process, I will say we have learned 4 main lessons as an institution. The first is that we need to match our finance with the values and our narrative. As I said, that is not an easy task because it requires really interrogating our actual allocations and interrogating the forms in which we do that grant making. The second lesson that we have learned is that we needed to begin to pay more attention to what those meaningful results of the grant look like, and perhaps stay away from just our understanding of what good grants look like, but to be much more open than we have been before. That is still hard, I will tell you, for program officers. They still, I will say, we operate in a culture in which there is a preference to see concrete products at the end, something that is tangible, you know, and that is not always the way, as you all know, that is not always the way in which indigenous organizations or indigenous community operate. So that has been also something that we have been trying to change, and the way we have been trying to change that is by integrating trainings for the program officers on what does meaningful change looks like, or what does resilient organizations look like, and expanding some of the concepts that they are used to when reviewing some of those reports and reviewing that relationship. The other thing that we learn is that it actually takes a long time for us to build strong relationships, you know, and that we couldn't do that by providing a grant that was just 1 year. You know, so in the past, we will say, well, we will put, you know, organizations on the pipeline, and if 1 year they deliver, then we can move them up on the scale. And what we have learned is that we actually need to provide funding that is multi-year, that is longer, if we want to be able to build that relationship with those organizations. Again, something that is still work in progress. And lastly, that we need to do a better job. In general, I will say balancing our own requirements and the requirements that the communities and organizations have. And we are trying to find creative ways on how to do that. We have an internal community of learning. So we have around 20 program officers that support indigenous communities, indigenous organizations, and those that work with indigenous people. And it is a space in which we come together and try to interpret some of the lessons that we are learning, so that there is a little bit more of also support for each other, because it's also the case that you don't always have all the support that you need in institutions like that. So it was really important for us to create a community that can support each other and can learn from each other. So I will stop there, Lourdes, but in general, I would say that's where we are as an institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I think it's great to hear some of the lessons that you're sharing with us, and I this question about in general of understanding how much of that funding is actually going to Indigenous-led organizations versus allies or intermediaries. It's one that it's of interest to IFIP. You know, the data that we have now available, we're finally we are in a position of accessing candid data, and then have been looking at other data that peer funders networks have been putting out. And we know that we need to do a little more work to do the analysis, to go dive deeper, to us and advocate for more disaggregated data from not only our members, but everyone that is in reporting, has been reporting to Foundation Center. And I think only that, having the knowledge of that data, it's one of the steps that we need to take to start kind of shifting and advocating for more of this work. So we'll continue the conversation and during the breakout. I'd like to invite now Casey Box to the spotlight. Casey will be sharing with us on the topic of funder accountability to the communities they claim they're serving and supporting. Casey Box brings over a decade of experience with expertise in advocating for Indigenous rights, participatory grant making, network building, and environmental issues. In 2013, after several years of supporting Landslides, he, not in 2013, sorry, recently, after several years of supporting Landslides, he transitioned into the role of the Global Strategy Director for the Christensen Fund. And he has extensive background that includes expertise in community organizing and social movement building. With that, I give you the floor, Casey.
Thank you, Lourdes, to the IFIP team and the entire IFIP community for inviting me to join this important discussion today. As Lourdes said, my name is Casey Box. I'm the Director of Global Strategy at the Christensen Fund, which is a private family foundation founded in 1957. At the Christensen Fund, we work to support Indigenous peoples in advancing their inherent rights, dignity, and self-determination. As Lourdes says, I've been working with Indigenous communities for many, many years and was formerly the Executive Director at Land is Life. I was given some prompt questions here, and I'll answer them as best I can, but what stops donors from directly funding Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-led organizations? Well, I think Indigenous peoples are facing some of the most daunting challenges in the world today. They are the most impacted by climate change. The loss of languages and cultures is real, and they reside on some of the most intact ecosystems on the planet, which should come by no surprise that their lands and territories are home to some of the most intact natural resources. This is why Indigenous peoples are increasingly under threat to outside forces that want to tap into those precious resources. In addition to this, grassroots priorities are constantly changing. I think all too often we categorize this as disorganization or a lack of strategy, but we should rather recognize that these realities that Indigenous peoples are facing are diverse and difficult, and that's why we must remain flexible. There are also some practical issues that are difficult to avoid. Tax benefits, expenditure responsibility, equivalency determination to a foreign organization is both tedious and expensive. I just got off the phone with an organization this morning telling me how taxing this process can be on their team. And that's why at TCF, we are actively looking at how we can further alleviate these pressures off partners and pay and equip them with tools to easily access other funding sources. So what stops funders from supporting and creating Indigenous-led funds? Absolutely nothing. There are so many funds operating and emerging every day. Colorado Plateau Foundation, Indian Collective, Land is Life, Huanca Fund, and Cultural Survival, just to name a few. The beauty about these Indigenous-led funds is that they each have their own processes and folks they support. And they're an opportunity to learn what the priorities of organizations and communities actually are and get to know organizations we have never heard of. They can often make much smaller, more flexible, more responsive grants than we can. They make my life way easy by handing over grant-making decisions to those who know about the issues best. And one grant from TCF to an Indigenous-led fund becomes a grant to many. Most importantly, they're Indigenous-led. IFIP has a list of these funds and a lot more resources on their website. I don't know if Lourdes, is it possible to share those links in the chat?
Yes, I will look it up, or one of my colleagues will.
Perfect. Thank you. And what does real concrete change for philanthropic practice look like? It's a really difficult question, but I think at its core, we must be good listeners. To be in good relationships with Indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations takes trust and transparency. This, as Monica highlighted, this trust and transparency can take time, and that's why we have to be patient. Without trust and transparency, we have nothing. And if you don't have time, or grant making is not your primary role, or your organization's processes are more rigid, give to Indigenous-led funds and trusted intermediaries. As Monica said, there are many intermediaries that have been working with Indigenous communities for many years, thus having strong relationships with those they work with. I've seen it with my own experiences, but intermediaries can provide support beyond grant dollars and are willing to be on the phone with folks every day. As Indigenous issues gather more attention globally and newer organizations are emerging or beginning to work on IP issues, I think it'd be really important for IFIP and others to uplift those intermediaries that have been effectively working with Indigenous communities for many decades. Here at TCF, we are actively learning from and owning up to our past. This year, we have taken bold steps to base everything we do off the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and all of our discussions are rooted in self-determination. We are actively listening to partners to think of more flexible ways we can support our partners and movements throughout the year. And a majority of our grants are multi-year and almost all of them are unrestricted. I look forward to continuing this discussion in the breakout groups, and thanks Lourdes again for inviting me.
Thank you, Casey. And I'm always excited to learn about the work that Christensen is doing. And as a former, or as we call ourselves now, TCF alumni, where there are several of us now across the world. But no, I think some of the points that you mentioned, thank you for touching on why I think as one process of accountability that funders need to be aware of is how do you all shift, because I'm no longer in the funding world. How do you all shift from questioning, from them sometimes wondering that grant is going to be high risk, to really investing in the relationship building, investing in those funds that have the ability and the knowledge and the know-how are connecting with communities closest. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it out. We're going to go into the next phase of the program. Thank you to Monica, Susan, and Casey for sharing with us. I believe I'm going to hand it over to Anka.
That's right. Hello, everyone. How's everyone today? Welcome again to day 3, the final day, the culmination of this retreat. I want to start by thanking everyone who spoke thus far. First, the IFIP team, Winnie and Chanda, thank you for not only the presentation, but getting us into the mindset, reminding us what we did yesterday. And thank you to all of our speakers, Susan, Monica, and Casey. Thank you for the honesty in your reflections. And I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of questions and a lot of ideas that we want to discuss in these breakouts. But before we head into the breakouts, I want to remind us of first what our core question of the day is, which is, again, where are we going and how will we get there, right? So the first day we talked about how did we get here? We looked back. The second day, or yesterday, we looked at where are we currently, what do we want and need, and now we're really looking into the future, about where are we going, and again, how will we get there. So we heard from Susan, and she was talking to us about her own Indigenous-led fund, the roles and lessons of philanthropy and commitments. Thank you, Susan, for that. We then heard from Monica on collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. From the Ford Foundation, thank you, Monica. And finally, from Casey on funder accountability to the communities they claim to be serving and supporting. So again, all questions that are not only important to think about, but important to think about as a collective and important to think about as the IFIP community. And to add one more component to it, for those of you who haven't been here with us on day 1 and day 2, what we've been doing is we've also had an interactive, a daily interactive, where we use Mural, a virtual tool, to collectively answer one question together. Today's question is going to be a little bit different because we want to prompt you to start thinking about it. If you really have answers that you want to put down, that's great, but we're going to bring this back up at the end of the retreat, right? So we want you all to use your breakouts and the discussions that you all have to inspire yourselves and to think about what are the commitments that we're going to be making for 2020, okay? So let me, again, let's pull up the mural. If the IFIP team can put the link in the chat. So for those who haven't used Mural, you're going to open the link. You're going to come in as either an anonymous animal, or you can name yourself as an anonymous animal. And once you are in the mural, this is what you'll see, essentially a virtual whiteboard with a lot of Post-its on it, with a lot of sticky notes. So I'm going to zoom in here. And you can zoom in using your trackpad, just zooming in as if you would on a phone. And today's question, again, is what commitments are we, IFIP community, but also individual members of the IFIP community, making for 2022, right? So again, the more specific question is, what work will you commit to doing as an individual within an organization, or as an organization, as the organization that you represent, that moves us forward, right? And that is why we did what we did yesterday, right? The mural that Chanda took us through at the beginning of our conversation today. What do we want to see the IFIP community bloom into? We have a lot of ideas, we have a lot of momentum, and now comes the time to say, okay, well, what are we going to do as individuals or as an organization to help us do that, to help us achieve, these goals and these ideas? So I see some of you are in here, some sharks, a spider. We got Lourdes, a visiting shrimp. Welcome, Lourdes. And what we're going to do now is I welcome all of you to, if you have ideas on your mind of what you want to commit to for the next year, grab a Post-it. You grab it simply just by clicking on it. It's a mouse, or it's also your trackpad click. And then you double click to start writing in here. And it is as simple as that. So if you have some ideas on commitments, I welcome you to write them now. Also really important, when you do write your commitments, please put your name or your institution's name in parentheses, so we know. So we can also see, you know, who are maybe committing to similar things, right? Maybe we want some sort of, I know we really wanted some working groups. That was something that came out yesterday from track A and track B. So let's see, you know, who's committing to certain things. Let's see how we can support each other and perhaps how IFIP can support you all as well. And in the spirit of Breakout 8, also keep each other accountable, right? So that is the mural for today. I will leave this open and I'll stay behind if anyone has questions on mural or if anyone needs help using it, I'll be here. But now I think I'm gonna send us all to a quick 10-minute break. So let's come back here at 45 minutes past the hour. And then once we come back, we're gonna head right into breakout rooms. So thanks again, everyone, and see you again in 10 minutes. And if any of you who are still here have questions on mural, do let me know. I'll be monitoring the chat and my DMs, or speak up and we can help you out. Before we even head into breakouts, I just want to say thank you everyone who is so excited and really got to work on their commitments. I want to make some more Post-its because I think there's still some folks who have some more commitments and we want to make room. But I'm really excited that we've really filled up the board. So this is great. So, you know, take a look at this for some inspiration when also going into your breakouts. So now let me share a little bit about how these breakouts are going to work. So for those of you who have been to track A, I see a few who've been to track A and B here. Welcome again. I wanted to remind us about how these breakouts work. So for the next 55 minutes, we're going to be in breakouts. Each breakout has a facilitator, someone from the lovely IFIP team, and potentially someone external. So you have a facilitator, and your facilitator will walk you through these core questions that are going to lead your discussion. So for breakout 6, we're going to be talking about Indigenous-led funds, roles and lessons of philanthropy, and their commitments. The two questions here are, what are the roles and lessons of Indigenous-led funds in philanthropy and their communities? These should sound familiar as we heard from our speakers on just this. And then also, how funders can support Indigenous-led funds, or how can funders support them, right? Then for breakout 7, we have collaboration to extend support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. And here we have 2 questions as well. What are different ways that people want to do this work? And what are different ways and collaborations people want to engage in on this topic? We even have a few examples, as well as the examples that we heard from our speaker, Monica, and also from our other 2, I think. We were all answering a little bit of this question. Then finally, for breakout 8, we have funder accountability to the communities they claim to be serving and supporting. And the 3 questions here are, what stops most funders from directly funding Indigenous peoples-led organizations, especially grassroots organizations? We heard from Casey, and that answer is not a lot. There shouldn't be much stopping you, but what might be those barriers? Another question here is, what stops funders from supporting creating Indigenous-led funds?
Why do funders prioritize and trust non-Indigenous led funds more, or organizations more? And then finally, what does real concrete change for philanthropic practice look like? So these are the 3 breakouts. You'll only be able to choose one. I know that they're all sounding really good right about now, but we want you to choose one. And then once you're in the group, which we will put you in just a second, you'll all get a link to this note stock. And in the note stock, you'll have everything that you need for this session. You have the community agreements right in front of you, so your facilitator will go over that with you. You'll select a presenter, someone to present back to the group. You'll have about 2 to 3 minutes. We want to keep it nice and short, so someone who's really able to synthesize well. And then here are your questions. A reminder here as well, as Lourdes was saying earlier, for the past few days, we've had more discussions, and we really want you to get more into the Minka mindset, meaning collaboratively working together on a collaborative goal, right? So these questions should lead you there. And we also, in the spirit of collaboration and participation, encourage you all to take notes. And so the notes will be here. Your facilitator will prompt you to think silently about each question before you enter a discussion. And so this is where you will do just that. So as a reminder, these are the 3 options of breakouts. Breakout 6, Indigenous-led funds. Breakout 7, support to Indigenous communities and smaller organizations. Breakout 8, funder accountability. All right. Everyone doing? Was the 55 minutes enough, or do we want another hour? No. I'm sure that we all want to continue the conversation, and hopefully next year it'll be in person, as people were saying and as folks were asking for on the mural, so that we can all meet in person. All right, so before we start and jump feet first into report backs, what I want to do is bring back up the mural really quickly. Let me put the link in the chat for you. So while we're listening to our colleagues present back, Molly, listening to your own group present back, if there are ideas that come up for you that you say, you know, I really want to commit to this, or this is something that, you know, I want to help IFIP do, please put it in that mural board. And let me share my screen, because I did a little bit of not only kind of cleaning up, but what I did was I pulled the big kind of ideas, right? The clusters of ideas that came up from day 2 on here, so that you guys remember kind of what we were wanting to see from IFIP, to see IFIP bloom into. So I put those up here for you to refer to if you want a little bit of extra inspiration. And yeah, so this is what we'll use the mural for. And with that said, I will now pass it on to, let's start with group 6. So Indigenous-led funds, Lourdes' group. Who's presenting from your group?
I again want to thank Anka and the whole IFIP team, and our transcribers and language interpreters who, and DCA Virtual, who have been accompanying us behind the scenes.
We're good to go.
That was a huge team effort. Yay, team. And all the facilitators. All right, we're good to go. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Okay, so let's start with breakout 6, Indigenous-led funds. And that was Adrian, who's going to be presenting for Lourdes' team. Please.
Yeah, so I'll kick off, and would also like to express my thanks to IFIP and the team for actually putting on these last 3 days and bringing a conversation, you know, that has really needed to be had, and you know, having, you know, a strong truth telling as part of that. I know that I will not capture the depth of the conversation that we had in 55 minutes, and was 55 minutes enough? I think by the end of it is we're all thinking that where did the 55 minutes go to? But we're exploring Indigenous-led funds, and one of the things that we grasped onto that kind of fed through the whole conversation was, was there a need for Indigenous led funds? And it kind of sprinkled through the conversation the whole time. And I'll try to capture this in a couple of very quick dot points. Not only Indigenous-led funds about whether they're needed, but also kind of the value of them, how they can operate, and then what we need to do. So we've spoken over this topic not just today, in the 55 minutes. It's actually come up over the last 3 days, and I think where we would have landed and where we have landed is that we've spoken about it for so long. That now it's time to stop talking and to start acting. However, with Indigenous-led funds, we need to be considering, do they actually have enough resources? And if we are to set them up, they do need to have those resources. We need to ensure that they simply don't replicate the current colonial practices, that starting a fund and having funding going into it is a starting point, but the gold standard is actually having an endowment attached to that, so it has sustainability beyond scrambling around and trying to raise funds every year. And lastly is that the commitment from the individuals, but also IFIP in moving forward to actually see this occur. I think internationally is kind of where we walked away from. Thank you.
Thank you for that very powerful summary. Moving from speaking to action. I think, Kim, you said an amazing quote yesterday. I don't want to misquote you. It was, stop the foundations from foundationing. What was it, Kim? That reminds me a little bit of that.
Yeah, it wasn't my quote. It was somebody in our group. I'll find it. Oh, here it is. More time listening and less time foundationing.
Yes, more time, less foundationing, or more foundationing, and making sure that Indigenous-led funds are ready for action, and we support them in doing that. Thank you very much. So now let's head to breakout 7 on Indigenous communities and small organizations and how to better support. That was Rachel's group who's presenting out from there.
Pearl will be presenting for us.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I might not do as quick and succinct as Adrian did, but the main themes that we were kind of broke it down into 2 questions. And the first one was really, what are the different ways that people want to work to do this? And some of the ways that we identified were that people want, and donors, foundations, or people generally want to work in authenticity and integrity. Often they don't know how to break through some of the barriers, and some of those are cultural barriers. Sometimes they don't even know how to find groups. And there's this issue about agency for staff, being able to actually fulfill on their commitments and what they're learning and actually applying that on the ground. Monica talked a bit about, from Ford, talked a bit about the restrictions that are set by their foundation, saying that, for example, their minimum grant was 200,000, and then they can't support more than 25%, like a certain percentage of the organization's financial capacity. So how do those numbers match up with really small Indigenous organizations, which sometimes, even $1,000 is life-changing for them? And then, or, how do we get them to scale up or not? And so also consider, so basically that was also, we talked about the use of intermediaries that might already have those relationships with Indigenous groups on the ground, as a second backup to funding directly Indigenous-led funds, but maybe that can help find them. and also promoting the horizontal collaboration between funds that are working in the same region and sometimes with the same organization. And that point also kind of leads us into the second question, was what were different ways and collaborations that people want to engage in on this topic? So like, how can we really do this? And we did mention there that one of our presenters from FEMI also said that in the feminist movement, there's been large donors getting together to unify some of the reporting and protocol procedures. And how do we actually learn from what the best ways of what each other are doing? And rather than kind of telling them this is our model, you got to fit into it, but then saying, okay, we're accompanying you along the process, and how can we listen and learn, and less foundationing, and actually learn alongside you. And so some other ways we were saying was to actually try out different alternative models of experimental grant making. There's lots of them out there right now. And then we talked a bit about what a real shift in power would look like. Is it just to have one Indigenous person on your board, or how many in a position of decision making? Are they in the majority positions of decision making in your organization? And I was just talked a bit about the experience in Canada. And then also collaborating, one of the ways to do this is collaborating together and sharing ideas of how to fund unregistered groups, how to link them with the fiscal sponsors. And that whole thing is actually, people are trying to change the law about that in Canada. So maybe that's something donors can really, and in the US can really gang up together and influence law to change that. And so the last thing on that was that one of the ways they can do that also is working together to reform the systems that allow more scrutiny of funders, to ensure that they meet their commitments to Indigenous communities and reduce the obligations that Indigenous communities are imposed on to be accountable to grant makers. So like reversing that role. We don't really, our presenter said she didn't really know how to do that, but I wanted to make sure that it could be possible. And I think that's a really important point that we could talk about into the future. So I hope I sort of captured that in a couple minutes.
Great, and right on time as well. I love hearing the day's core question kind of come to fruition. It really sounds like it's like a lot of action-oriented conversations and things that you can all, take away into your own very different foundations and work. So that's really great to hear. And let's wrap it up with Funder Accountability Breakout 8. Who's presenting from Paloma's group, Paloma and Kim's group?
Suzanne is going to be presenting.
Thank you, Paloma. So I'm going to try to do the same. And if I miss anything, I hope others will jump in after. So our three questions were, the first one was, what stops most funders from directly funding Indigenous people-led organization, especially grassroots organizations, and sometimes with non-Western oriented organizational group structures? And the answer to that question came in the layers of the structural and systemic that we've been discussing around just the structural challenges of, being IRS certified, or what are the pathways to even being recognized within the funding system, and then into the layer of the relational and the community building element around what is the access to understanding and education around what are different models of impact and how can these be understood as effective, and the ability to sort of bring about new models of monitoring and evaluation that can supplant the ones that then go toward the final layer, which have to do with sort of inner world and worldview barriers that funders are experiencing that may be based on their identity and things that are deeply held about who they believe themselves to be, that require the funding to become something that is transformational for them as well. And so we see particularly this need for like changing of mental map and framework that can be very difficult, especially when money is the question. And so there are structural and interpersonal, educational, community building, and also inner dimensions of change that need to take place. The second question was, what stops them from supporting and creating Indigenous-led funds, and why do they prioritize and trust non-Indigenous-led organizations more? Very related to the first question as well. This one we delved a little bit more deeply into how it may feel almost counterintuitive for some funders, because Indigenous communities are coming from a values grounded perspective. And it's really as described in the core values of respect and reciprocity. So investment in these kinds of organizations may not relate directly to Western models of success and impact. And so that is one barrier that can be overcome by developing greater trust or greater exposure to Indigenous-led models. The second barrier that really stands in the way is around the level of change needed on the personal level and the recognition and how it can be very uncomfortable for a person who maybe has benefited from a specific worldview to be in recognition that that worldview may have caused harm. And so what are the ways of inviting that level of engagement? Because sometimes that feeling of guilt and powerlessness to help actually can create a sense of avoidance or denial when there should be maybe a sense of like engagement and being involved, right? And it's a very subtle thing. It's not always right on the surface for people. Also, if this is a model they haven't embarked on before, it might feel really unknown to them and they don't know how to navigate it. And it's not always clear how to make sure that, for example, international funding makes it to local, smaller community-led Indigenous initiatives, or even domestically, that can be hard for people to navigate. So clarifying those pathways. And then the final question, which was the one specifically around what does real concrete change for philanthropic practice look like in light of these challenges? And the responses were around really being able to invest in taking the time to develop those relationships with Indigenous peoples, committing, walking the talk of committing to multi-year funds, and inviting, of course, engagement from Indigenous peoples in the creation of and the analysis of the impact of such funds. To get around some of the issues having to do with the inner world and identity challenges that individual philanthropies might be facing, the notion of transformation journeys that go beyond visiting and sort of celebrating, but actually provide philanthropies and funders with an opportunity to consider that worldviews that are different than their own might actually be in service to them as well, and to provide them with outlets and ways to explore those without feeling maybe that it's too fast or that it's uncomfortable or they don't understand. And so such a model that would provide that kind of exposure while also not like taxing Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-led communities of their emotional energy. So how to create models like that are held by possibly other, settler descended allies, et cetera. And then also enactments of Indigenous-led processes at scale that demonstrate what the kind of success how to create a narrative of success that philanthropies can step into that actually helps them be able to celebrate success differently outside of their usual like return on investment, number of wells dug, et cetera, that they might be still attached to, and giving them a new sense of status within their giving. And then finally, that piece around the relationship again and the collective power and education and movement building within existing organizations on best practices, finding what's working, inviting, it's like a learning agenda, a shared learning agenda and shared goals, and just really being able to celebrate and bring about a sense of cohesion while also celebrating difference and diversity across the whole. And so now I'll stop and someone else might have something that I missed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. That was a great note to end it on. One that is concrete yet hopeful for the future. So I'm really excited that the discussions went well. And again, I know a lot of you wanted to be in all of the discussions. The notes will be up on Swapcard. The IFIP team is figuring that out as we speak. So you'll be able to see that as well as see the recordings of the conversations as well. So with that, we're going to transition into the close of not only this day, but of the event for Track A. First, we'll hear from Lourdes for a closing circle and a wrap up. And then we hope that you can stay with us for our final closing offering. So let me pass it on to Lourdes, and thanks again to everyone for participating and facilitating and presenting back. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Anka, and thank you for everyone who volunteered to report back and for the facilitators of our last day. I think I felt like we had wonderful conversations throughout the 3 days. I definitely had a sense of sometimes 55 minutes seems long, but when you're so deep in conversation, it goes by so quickly. So I appreciate for all of you for staying all the way through, and please stay for the closing offering. We have invited back Alma to help us close as we should. But before I go there, I'd like to just, I think on day one, as I was sharing, and I'm gonna share quickly my screen. So on day one, and I'm not gonna go over this slide, but on day one, we started just kind of giving you a sense of where we have been, what we have been doing over the last 5 years and how we've been kind of thinking about the work. I wanted to focus today on sharing a little bit of what are we going to be focusing on 2022. Definitely, there's a lot of things that the IFIP team needs to sit with and needs to look at for all the stickies that you put on the mural. So I want to highlight that that's also going to inform the work that we're going to be bringing into our next work plan. Not just next calendar year, but the next work plan for IFIP. But some of the things that are already being discussed at the moment is continue to do the work that we need to do on collaboration and convenience in person and virtual. I cannot tell you how much I'm itching to go back to in person. And so that might look like doing perhaps smaller gatherings, more regional gatherings next year, so that those who are unable to travel internationally are still able to participate in person. But we know that virtual is not, while it's helpful, I think we would all love to be back in person and sharing community space. I think we are discussing about holding one that it's already in conversations, Indigenous-led funds funders dialogue focused on Latin America, another funder dialogue focused on Indigenous women. And again, I think that touching on, I think it was Margarita, one of the comments that she made on what the feminist funders are doing, an effort to influence more of feminist funding going to Indigenous women organizations. Another one is a gathering of that we have the name and Andes in Philanthropy for Indigenous women who are in a position in mainstream foundations to bring us together, do a lot, some of the healing work that we all like to be part of, as well as some of the strategizations on how we move more funding, both for Indigenous women, but also more at large. And in terms of new resources, you heard from Winnie where we're heading and why it's so important to receive from you the information that we ask through the application process or renewal process. We also want to commission a larger, more landscape funding analysis of where's the funding going for Indigenous peoples and specifically Indigenous-led organizations and some other things, but we will continue to again focus on strengthening the organization, because part of this work takes also having an organization, having a team to be able to deliver all the things that we would like to do, but also the things that you as a community of members and Indigenous-led funds would like us to do and play, and the roles we would like us to play more of. So the next phase of our organizational strengthening will focus on communications and rebranding. And one, I think, a specific outcome or commitment that is coming out of the breakout that we just had, focus on Indigenous-led funds, I shared with them that a commitment from IFIP, particularly in this work, is to bring in a staff that is going to be dedicated to the Indigenous-led funds working group, and a commitment from that group for the Indigenous-led funds that were in that breakout to help us shape what the position would look like. So with that, I want to thank everyone for engaging engaging in dialogue and conversation. And I hope you you continue to use the platform, which is going to stay open. You're going to be able to watch the recordings of both the community dialogues and report backs, because you all have now access to Swapcard. So you're going to be able to do that and go back to it and revisit the conversations. So I now want to just invite us to kind of come to a close. For those of you who are with us, please turn on your cameras as we go and invite Alma to lead us through the closing offering. Thank you so much. Si podría prender su cámara. Vamos a empezar el cierre con su invocación. Le agradecemos por estar con nosotros nuevamente.
Gracias. Es que no tenía el intérprete, por eso no había escuchado. Muchas gracias a todas, muchas gracias a sus energías. De nuevo, muchas gracias por su luz, por su fuerza también, por seguir tejiendo hilos de muchos colores desde sus organizaciones y espacios para poder fortalecer los liderazgos que vienen creciendo, que se vienen gestando desde la historia. Hoy quisiera compartir con ustedes estos dos elementos que les presento. El primero es la fuerza del incienso, el aroma del incienso. Y voy a pedir que todas, si es posible, puedan poner sus cámaras y puedan poner enfrente de su pantalla, sus manos abiertas. Sus manos abiertas para agradecer las energías del corazón del cielo, las energías del corazón de la tierra y la fuerza de la vela. Y sientan que este incienso está pasando por cada una de las células de su cuerpo, por cada una de las células de su ser, y está entrando hasta el centro del espíritu de cada una y de cada uno. Que puede habitar, el centro de su espíritu puede habitar en el corazón, en algunos de los órganos de su ser, en un brazo, en una mano, en el vientre, en su pelvis, en los pies, en el sentido, en donde sientan, en donde ubican el espíritu de su ser y sientan que esta energía del incienso está llegando a cada una con toda la fuerza y determinación. Y con este incienso les ofrezco que lo reciban y guarden en lo más profundo de su ser esa fuerza de liderazgo que cada una de ustedes desde sus distintos espacios tiene y guarda. Si soy una tejedora desde la cooperación internacional, si soy una tejedora desde ser una donante, si soy una tejedora desde un centro de investigación, si soy una tejedora de liderazgo desde una organización, si soy una tejedora a través de una agencia que gestiona los recursos, o si soy una tejedora desde de mi ser individual que se convierte en colectivo. Reciban este incienso y con esa fuerza envíenlo a cada una de las personas, los seres o las organizaciones que hacen posible su liderazgo, a la historia de su pueblo, a los seres de su familia que les acompañan en lo cotidiano y que hacen posible que tejan su liderazgo. Cierren sus manos, como ya recibieron la fuerza del incienso, y llévanlo a una parte de su cuerpo donde sientan que asienta su espíritu. En esa parte del cuerpo siéntanlo y agradezcamos con una inclinación a la cabeza, agradeciendo a la Madre Tierra porque nos dejó existir y nos permitió hilar ese liderazgo. Ahora voy a poner la fuerza de la luz, de la vela, y esta fuerza de la vela no es para nosotras, es para las otras o los otros, que ayudan a que yo teja mi liderazgo. Puede ser mi pareja, pueden ser mis hijas, puede ser la compañera de la organización, puede ser la persona que se hace responsable de mi familia cuando a mí no me toca estar, o si estoy viviendo en un espacio solo para mí, esa casa que me permite abrigarme para que yo pueda servir a otros. Entonces, esta vela es asentada para ustedes, y para las personas o seres o parte de este plano tierra que les ayuda a hacer el liderazgo. Si ya logramos asentar a quién le vamos a ofrecer nuestra luz, entonces ahora unamos los dos elementos, el incienso y la vela, y cubramos todo ese entorno en el que estamos, las organizaciones, el centro, la institución, el grupo, el sector con el que trabajo, y cubramos con esta luz y este incienso a cada una y a cada uno. Y agradezcamos al universo y a la tierra porque nos ha permitido estar en este momento aquí y ahora para servir. Que los resultados de este encuentro sigan fortaleciendo ese rol de las mujeres en la toma de decisiones, pero que esa toma de decisiones pase por su persona, por su vida personal y luego se pueda volver en toma de decisiones colectivas. Que ahora podamos seguir sembrando semillas para que los gobiernos, los estados, las instituciones, las organizaciones fortalezcan la vida de las mujeres, pero desde aquellas mujeres que no conocemos sus rostros, pero que hemos trabajado junto para ellas, o para aquellas mujeres que a veces solo las vemos del otro lado, pero que no sabemos cómo es su vida. Honremos y ofrezcamos esta luz y este incienso para ellas y para ellos, y pidamos esa fuerza que se identifique entre nosotras. Y ahora voy a pedir que todas podamos, si tenemos abiertos o cerrados los ojos, que podamos concentrarnos en este movimiento y podamos agradecer profundamente a nosotras por permitirnos este tiempo y este espacio para servir a otras y a otros, para acompañar a otros y a otros, para ser aliada de otras y otros, para que ese liderazgo se haga uno solo y les permita a ustedes seguir acompañando. Y entonces nos asentamos las manos al centro y en el corazón. Y una en la cabeza, porque ahí están nuestros sentidos y ahí está la sabiduría ancestral que traemos, pero también la sabiduría que hemos tejido en estos años que tenemos de vida y de existencia. Soltamos las manos y las ponemos en las piernas y agradecemos porque nos han llevado, nos han acompañado a caminar, a transitar por esta plano tierra y poder servir. Y volvemos con nuestras manos hacia adelante y nos inclinamos ante todas las que están enfrente de nuestra pantalla y decimos gracias. Una, gracias dos y gracias 3 veces por este tiempo, por este espacio y por esta existencia. Y fortalecemos nuestros corazones agradeciendo el camino recorrido y la fuerza de los liderazgos a los que hemos acompañado. Y ahora hacemos hacia arriba el movimiento y agradecemos al cielo de nuevo por lo que nos regaló este día y durante estos 3 días de trabajo. Porque los resultados, porque los diálogos que hayamos tejido, porque las propuestas que hayamos encontrado nos permitan avanzar con fuerza, con determinación. Cerramos nuestras manos y vamos a aplaudir. El sonido del aplauso es para agradecer a todas y todos su tiempo, su espacio, su ser, su espíritu, sus ideas y sus pensamientos, unidos a este proceso que están desarrollando de manera colectiva. Y otra vez nos inclinamos y agradecemos. Y con esto agradecer estos 2 elementos que nos acompañaron y se los dejo para que les siga dando fuerza, luz y energía. Y para que sigan construyendo desde adentro y para las mujeres y para el mundo y para la humanidad, energías de luz y la fuerza de los liderazgos. Muchas gracias y que la energía de luz quede con cada una, pero sobre todo que su espíritu interno quede fuerte para seguir avanzando en el camino que les toca recorrer. Muchas gracias y hasta siempre.
Muchas gracias, estimada Alma, por acompañarnos nuevamente para el cierre y por dar la invocación. Sus palabras siempre a mí, a escucharla en el primer día y ahora nuevamente escucharla al cierre recibo la energía de usted, de sus palabras, y me ayuda también a esclarecer mi mente. Muchas gracias.
A ustedes, gracias por permitirme compartir un momento con ustedes. Gracias.
So we have come to the close. I again thank you. Maybe we can spotlight everyone that played a role. I don't know if that's possible or not. I don't want to add anything else to my team, but I want to again thank Anka for leading us through the last 3 days with her amazing facilitation abilities. And to the whole IFIP team, thank you for everything that you've done to get us to the close of the 3 days, and everyone else that have made this retreat possible, to our facilitators, the speakers, and everyone who is here. I truly appreciate all of you who have stayed with us through the end and to be part of the closing offering. Thank you until the next one, and I really hope we can be in person on the next one, so we'll give you more updates as to when we can arrive to a decision as to the date and the location of our next, hopefully, global conference. Thank you very much.